Leonard Briggs was the coach everyone in Milltown trusted, and Evan Brooks was the young assistant everyone admired. But when jealousy and pride collided, one man's obsession turned deadly, leaving a body sprawled across a rival team's court in a crime that shocked the entire town. Coach Leonard Briggs had been a towering figure in Milltown for more than a decade. He wasn't the kind of coach people forgot easily. Standing tall with a commanding presence, his voice could fill a gymnasium without the help of a microphone. Parents admired his dedication, students feared his authority, and administrators valued his results. Under his leadership, the Milltown High Tigers went from being just another small-town team to champions with a shelf full of trophies. Year after year, the Tigers advanced to regional finals, and Leonard's reputation grew. For many in town, he was more than just a coach. He was a symbol of discipline, hard work, and success. But Leonard was not the type of man who thrived on teamwork. He was a man who thrived on power. Every win, every strategy, every victory was his to claim, and he guarded that territory like a predator. To outsiders, his stern face on the sidelines looked like the face of focus, but to those who truly knew him, it was a mask covering a temper ready to ignite at the smallest spark. Players whispered about his punishments during practice, the endless drills, the screaming sessions that broke them down, yet no one complained too loudly. As long as the team kept winning, Leonard was untouchable. The town of Milltown itself was small and ordinary, but basketball gave it life. On Friday nights, families packed the high school gym, wearing orange and black, cheering the Tigers on. For parents who worked long hours in factories or small-town businesses, those games were a source of pride and community spirit. And at the center of it all was Coach Briggs. He was the one who gave the town bragging rights. Children grew up idolizing him, hoping one day to wear a Tigers jersey. Even rival towns grudgingly respected him, though they despised his arrogance. Despite all the admiration, Leonard lived with a constant fear, though he never admitted it. He feared losing control. He feared being replaced, forgotten, or overshadowed. He had worked too hard, built his name too carefully, to let anyone take it away from him. He ruled his team like a king, and kings do not willingly share their thrones. This fear, this gnawing insecurity, hid beneath the surface of his victories. Every game he won only made him more desperate to hold on to his crown. His personal life was no different. Leonard lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town, though he had once been married. His wife had left years earlier, worn down by his obsession with winning and his inability to separate his temper from his home life. He spoke little about her, and most avoided asking. To him, basketball was all that remained, the only thing that gave him worth. Without it, he was nothing, and Leonard Briggs could not tolerate the thought of being nothing. In Milltown, people looked at Leonard and saw a hero. What they didn't see was the darkness that had slowly been building within him, a darkness that only needed the right spark to explode. That spark was about to arrive in the form of someone young, ambitious, and full of new ideas. Someone who would soon step into Leonard's carefully built kingdom, threatening everything he had worked for. Evan Brooks arrived in Milltown with a kind of energy the town hadn't seen in years. At just 24 years old, he was fresh out of college, carrying with him the confidence of youth and the hunger to prove himself. Unlike most assistants who blended into the background, Evan had a presence that immediately stood out. He was tall, athletic, and approachable, with a smile that made people feel comfortable. The players warmed up to him almost instantly. To them, he wasn't just another coach barking orders. He was someone who understood their world, someone who could balance discipline with encouragement. Parents noticed it too, whispering among themselves that this young man might be the future of Milltown basketball. The school board had hired Evan because they believed the team needed fresh ideas. Leonard Briggs was a winner, but his methods were old-fashioned and harsh. Many felt the players were being pushed too far, and though no one dared challenge Leonard openly, concerns had been quietly growing. Evan was supposed to be a support system, someone to bridge the gap between the coach's strictness and the players' morale. What no one anticipated was how quickly Evan would start to shine in his role. Within weeks, he wasn't just assisting, he was leading. Evan's approach to coaching was different. Instead of relying on fear to motivate, he inspired through trust and connection. He spent extra time working with players who struggled, teaching them techniques patiently instead of berating them. He encouraged creativity on the court, letting the boys experiment with plays and trust their instincts. His methods brought out a side of the team that had been missing under Leonard's iron fist. Soon, players who once dreaded practices were actually looking forward to them. It wasn't long before the crowd started to notice too. They could see how the boys lit up when Evan was around, how their energy and teamwork seemed stronger when his influence was present. At first, Leonard tried to ignore it. He told himself that Evan was just new and exciting, that the glow would fade. But it didn't. Every practice revealed the growing loyalty the players had toward Evan. Every game highlighted his clever strategies that Leonard would never have considered. Slowly, the spotlight began to shift. After a close win, a group of parents congratulated Evan instead of Leonard. After another victory, students started chanting Evan's name from the bleachers. What had once been Leonard's uncontested kingdom was now a stage he was being forced to share. And sharing was something Leonard had never done well. Though Evan meant no harm, he underestimated just how much pride ruled Leonard's life. To Evan, he was simply doing his job, giving his best for the players and for the school. To Leonard, however, Evan was a growing threat, a rival in disguise. Every smile, every handshake, every compliment directed toward Evan felt like a knife in Leonard's back. The veteran coach had built his reputation for years, only to feel it slipping because of a newcomer barely old enough to rent a car. The balance of power had begun to tilt, and everyone could sense it except Evan. He thought he had found his place in Milltown, but in reality, he had stepped directly into a storm he never saw coming. The tension between Leonard Briggs and Evan Brooks had been building for weeks, like a storm gathering on the horizon. It wasn't sudden, it was gradual, small sparks that eventually grew into flames. Leonard noticed every detail, every interaction, every moment where his authority seemed to slip. He saw how the players leaned in closer when Evan spoke, how they smiled at his encouragement, how they trusted his judgment. What ate away at Leonard the most was that they looked at Evan the way they used to look at him. That adoration had once been his fuel, his crown, his proof that he mattered. Now it was slipping through his hands, and it was slipping fast. The breaking point came during the biggest game of the season, a match that would decide if the Tigers advanced to the regional playoffs. The gym was packed to the brim, the sound of the crowd echoing off the walls, a mix of nerves and excitement hanging in the air. Leonard had prepared his players for weeks, drilling them hard, running them through punishing practices that left them exhausted but sharp. He believed this was his game, his victory to claim, the moment that would remind everyone why he was the one in charge. But things didn't go according to plan. With only seconds left on the clock, the Tigers trailed by 3 points. Leonard called a timeout, already certain of the play they would run. He barked out his instructions with his usual fire, but the players hesitated, glancing toward Evan, who stood at the edge of the huddle. And then it happened. Evan quietly offered a different idea, a riskier move that Leonard would never have approved. The players, hungry for a win and desperate for a spark of creativity, leaned toward Evan's plan instead. When the timeout ended, they ran onto the court following his instructions, not Leonard's. The crowd watched in disbelief as the final play unfolded. The Tigers passed quickly, weaving through the defense, setting up for a shot no one expected. The ball sailed through the air and dropped cleanly through the hoop, just as the buzzer sounded. The gym erupted in screams and cheers, the noise deafening. Parents jumped to their feet. Students waved their banners wildly. And for the first time in Leonard's career, the crowd wasn't chanting his name. They were chanting Evans. Leonard stood frozen on the sidelines, his face expressionless, though inside his rage boiled. This was supposed to be his victory, his proof of dominance. Instead, the night belonged to Evan Brooks. Reporters rushed to get quotes from the young assistant. Parents surrounded him with handshakes, and players lifted him up like a hero. Leonard could feel himself being pushed into the shadows, a ghost in a game he had built from the ground up. It was more than humiliation. It was betrayal. When Leonard left the gym that night, his mind was already set. He convinced himself that Evan wasn't just stealing attention. He was stealing his life, his legacy, the very foundation of who he was. And in Leonard's world, there was only one way to deal with someone who threatened everything he had built. He decided that Evan Brooks would have to be removed, not just from the team, but permanently. What started as jealousy had transformed into something darker, something lethal, and the clock was already ticking toward a violent end. 2 nights after the humiliating game, Leonard Briggs carried out the plan that had been circling in his mind like a vulture. He called Evan under the pretense of discussing strategy for the upcoming playoffs, telling him they needed to meet privately to go over adjustments. Evan, ever eager to prove himself and thinking this was finally a chance to work side by side with the legendary coach, agreed without hesitation. He didn't realize that by saying yes, he was walking into a trap that had been carefully laid out by the very man he trusted. Leonard drove his old pickup truck across town, heading toward a place that had long been a symbol of rivalry, the Ridgeview Panthers Gymnasium. For years, Milltown's fiercest battles had been fought there, the walls echoing with insults, the courts slick with sweat from hard-fought games. To Leonard, there was something poetic about choosing that spot. Not only would he rid himself of Evan, but he would also stage the act in a way that would taunt their rivals. It was cruelty wrapped in symbolism, a twisted message only he could understand fully. When Evan arrived, the gym was dark, the parking lot empty, and the silence heavy. Leonard had used his connections to access the building late at night, knowing no one would be around to interrupt. He led Evan inside, making small talk about practice schedules and playoff strategies, masking his true intentions with a calm, professional tone. Evan followed, unaware of the danger lurking only steps ahead. Once they reached the middle of the court, Leonard acted. Hidden beneath his jacket was a metal bar, heavy and cold. In a sudden burst of violence, he swung it at Evan with a force born out of weeks of festering rage. The first blow struck the young assistant's head, dropping him to the polished wooden floor. The sound echoed in the cavernous gym, bouncing off the walls like the final whistle of a game. Evan didn't even have time to scream. Leonard struck again to make sure there would be no chance of survival. The sight of Evan's body lying motionless in the center of the court sent a strange calm over Leonard. He dragged the lifeless figure until it rested directly on top of the Ridgeview Panthers painted logo, the symbol of his school's greatest rival. To him, it was a final insult, a statement that would haunt both schools. By leaving Evan there, Leonard hoped suspicion would fall on Ridgeview, turning the tragedy into a scandal that would distract everyone from him. He even took care to wipe down surfaces, making it appear as though the scene was untouched. For a moment, Leonard stood over the body, staring at what he had done. His hands shook, not from regret, but from the adrenaline of carrying out the unthinkable. He convinced himself it was necessary, that Evan had been stealing his spotlight and destroying his legacy. In his twisted logic, this was justice, the only way to reclaim what was his. As he walked back to his truck under the cover of night, leaving Evan behind, Leonard told himself that no one would ever trace this back to him. He believed he had just committed the perfect crime. What he didn't know was that the cracks in his plan had already begun to show, and the rival court would become the stage for his downfall. The next morning, the Ridgeview Panthers gymnasium became the center of a nightmare no one in town could have imagined. Students arriving early for practice opened the doors to find the court strangely quiet, the air heavy with a smell that didn't belong in a gym. When their eyes fell on the center of the floor, screams erupted. Lying motionless on the rival team's painted logo was Evan Brooks. His body sprawled unnaturally, his clothing stained, his face pale. Panic spread instantly. Teachers rushed to lock down the building, police were called, and within minutes, what had once been the stage for basketball glory had transformed into a crime scene. News traveled fast. Milltown and Ridgeview were towns built on rivalry, and now that rivalry had been soaked in blood. At first, whispers spread that Ridgeview players or supporters must have been behind it, a cruel act of violence meant to taunt Milltown by leaving their assistant coach's body on enemy territory. Parents demanded answers, reporters swarmed the area, and both schools were thrown into chaos. But investigators quickly realized this was not an act of random violence. It was personal, deliberate, and carefully staged. Detectives scoured the gym for clues. They found marks on the polished floor where the body had been dragged into position. Near the back of the building, faint tire tracks cut into the dirt, leading back toward the road. Security cameras, though grainy, captured the outline of a truck entering the parking lot late at night. The shape of the vehicle matched one familiar to almost everyone in Milltown Leonard Briggs's old pickup. At first, some refused to believe it. Leonard was a coach, a mentor, a man the town had celebrated for years. But the evidence began to build piece by piece, and denial slowly turned into suspicion. When investigators searched Leonard's home, they uncovered the detail that sealed his fate. Hidden in his basement was Evan's phone, its case cracked from the struggle. Leonard had kept it, perhaps as a trophy, perhaps out of arrogance, but its presence tied him directly to the crime. Combined with the tire tracks, the camera footage, and the witness accounts of Leonard meeting Evan that night, the picture became clear. The man who had led the Tigers to victory was the same man who had orchestrated this brutal act. The community was shattered. Parents who once praised Leonard now spoke of betrayal. Players who had once followed him with respect now recoiled in horror, realizing their coach had killed the very assistant who had been guiding them with kindness. At trial, the truth came out in painful detail. Prosecutors described Leonard's jealousy, his obsession with control, and his plan to stage the body on the rival court as both revenge and misdirection. The jury took little time to convict him of murder. Leonard Briggs, once a hero, was sentenced to life in prison. The legacy he fought so hard to protect was destroyed in an instant. The Ridgeview court, once just another place of competition, became forever remembered as the site where ambition, pride, and rage collided in the most horrifying way. Evan Brooks's life ended far too soon, and the town of Milltown learned that even its most trusted figure was capable of the darkest betrayal.